afternoon of February 14, 2018, the corridors of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School were transformed into a theatre of carnage. Nicholas Cruz moved through the building with the tactical efficiency of a hunter, executing 17 students and staff members while critically wounding 17 others. Yet, the brutality of the massacre was merely the prelude to a secondary act of deception. Seated within the sterile confines of the Broward Sheriff's Office interrogation room, Cruz did not project the arrogance of a mass murderer, but rather the confusion of a victim. He began to weave a narrative of auditory hallucinations and demonic possession, whispering about a voice that commanded him to kill. This was a calculated gambit to evade the death penalty by feigning psychosis, a strategy known clinically as malingering. Cruz believed his performance could manipulate seasoned forensic psychiatrists and outmaneuver the Florida legal system. However, the unblinking eye of the interrogation camera captured what he failed to conceal: the subtle recalibrations of a liar. As we dissect the footage and the extensive psychological evaluations, we witness the systematic dismantling of his facade, revealing that the only demon present was the cold rationality of the killer himself. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. To understand the magnitude of the deception attempted in the interrogation room, one must first dismantle the history that preceded it. The architecture of the insanity defense relies heavily on a documented history of severe psychosis, a detachment from reality that renders the subject incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. In the case of Nicholas Cruz, the historical record presents a chaotic mosaic of behavioral disorders and developmental delays, yet it glaringly lacks the hallmarks of the schizophrenia he would later try to mimic. His life began with a fundamental disruption. Born in September 1998 to a mother with a history of substance abuse and criminal convictions, before being adopted almost immediately by Roger and Linda Cruz. They brought him into a sprawling home in Parkland, Florida, an affluent suburb designed for tranquility, a setting that would stand in stark contrast to the internal and external turbulence that soon defined the boy's life. From an early age, the behavioral deviations were not just present, they were loud and violent. By the age of 3, reports surfaced of him throwing items and displaying an unusual aggression toward other children. The clinical assessments that followed throughout his schooling painted a picture of a child struggling with emotional regulation, diagnosed variously with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. These are significant challenges, certainly, but they are grounded in behavioral control and impulse management, distinct from the hallucinations or delusions required for a successful plea of insanity. The tragedy of his early years was compounded by the sudden death of his adoptive father, Roger, in 2004. Left to raise Nicholas and his brother alone, Linda Cruz struggled to contain the growing volatility in her home. The escalation was linear and documented with clinical precision by the Broward County school system and local law enforcement. Police records indicate that deputies responded to the Cruz residence upwards of 40 times over the course of a decade. These calls were not in response to a boy fighting invisible demons or responding to voices in his head. They were responses to domestic disturbances, property damage, and violence against his mother and brother. The pattern established here was one of rage, not psychosis. He learned that escalation yielded results, and when the structure of traditional schooling became untenable, he was shuffled between alternative education centers, including Cross Creek School, which specialized in emotional and behavioral disabilities. Even there, the staff noted his fascination with violence, not as a product of fear, but as a source of fixation. A critical component of the persona he would later adopt was rooted in his obsession with weapons and the macabre. This was not a sudden onset of violent ideation, but a cultivated hobby. He began posturing on social media, curating a digital identity that thrived on fear. On Instagram, he posted images of dismembered animals, a classic precursor to human violence often found in the histories of serial offenders. He engaged in self-harm, notably cutting his arms, yet he would later use these scars as props in his narrative of mental collapse. The cruelty he inflicted on animals, shooting chickens, poking a toad, killing a lizard, displayed a lack of empathy and a desire for dominance. It was a cold, calculated cruelty, devoid of the frantic confusion that accompanies a psychotic break. He knew what he was doing, and more importantly, he understood the reaction it would elicit. The acquisition of the weapon that would become infamous, the Smith & Wesson M&P 15 sport rifle, occurred in February 2017. He purchased it legally, navigating the background check process with a lucid mind. A person in the throes of a debilitating psychosis, tormented by voices commanding them to kill, rarely possesses the executive function required to fill out federal firearms paperwork, save the necessary funds, and maintain the composure to complete a retail transaction. This purchase was an investment in a fantasy he had been nurturing for years. He began stockpiling ammunition, magazines, and tactical gear. This preparation phase is the antithesis of legal insanity. It demonstrates foresight, planning, and an understanding of cause and effect. The unraveling of his social tether accelerated in November 2017, when Linda Cruz passed away from complications of the flu. This left Nicholas legally an orphan and unmoored from the only authority figure who had consistently attempted to advocate for him. He bounced between living situations, briefly staying with a family friend, before moving in with the Sneed family. James and Kimberly Sneed, who took him in, saw a young man who was depressed and socially awkward, but they did not see a raving lunatic. They enforced rules regarding his firearms, requiring them to be locked in a safe. In a display of cunning that defies the logic of the insane, Nicholas kept the key to the safe, ensuring he retained access to his arsenal while outwardly complying with the house rules. In the weeks leading up to February 14, 2018, the mask of the school shooter was fully affixed. He was not hearing the voice of a demon. He was hearing the siren call of infamy. 3 days before the massacre, he utilized his cell phone to record a series of videos that serve as the most damning evidence against his later claims of insanity. In these videos, filmed with a steady hand and a calm, flat affect, he outlines his plan with chilling clarity. He introduces himself, states his objective to become the next school shooter, and details the logistics of the attack. He discusses the Uber he will take, the rifle he will use, and even estimates the casualty count. There is no mention of demons, no plea for help, and no sign of confusion. He speaks of the notoriety he craves, explicitly stating that everyone will know who he is. This was a marketing pitch for his own infamy, recorded by a mind that was entirely oriented toward reality and the consequences of his actions. The persona of the demon-possessed killer was a contingency plan, a seed planted in the soil of his previous behavioral diagnoses, but watered by his own duplicity. He knew that his history of outbursts and special education would provide a convenient cover. He stopped attending mental health counseling and ceased taking medication in the months prior, clearing his system and his schedule for the violence to come. 14th, he did not wake up in a fugue state. He engaged in a normal routine, communicated with the Sneed family, and dressed in the burgundy ROTC polo shirt, a calculated choice to blend in with the students he intended to target. He packed his rifle case, filled his backpack with magazines, and summoned the Uber. Every step was a decision made by a rational, albeit morally depraved actor. The demon he would later introduce to Detective Curcio was not present in the Uber. It was not present when he walked into the stairwell to assemble his rifle. And it was certainly not present when he pulled the fire alarm to maximize the target density. The entity that walked into Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School was not a vessel for supernatural evil, but a young man who had spent a lifetime rehearsing for a role he was finally ready to play. The 14th of February 2018 began under the guise of distinct normalcy for the residents of Parkland, Florida, a wealthy enclave known for its safety and manicured serenity. At Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, the school day was nearing its conclusion. The dismissal bell was scheduled to ring shortly, releasing thousands of students into the humid afternoon. However, miles away, a calculated sequence of events was already in motion, initiated by a former student whose behavioral history was a tapestry of red flags and missed interventions. At 2:06 in the afternoon, Nicholas Cruz ordered an Uber. He did not conceal his destination. He was headed to the very institution that had expelled him a year prior. When the vehicle arrived to collect him, he was carrying a black rifle case, later described to the driver as music equipment. The banality of the interaction masked the catastrophic intent contained within that luggage. The ride was unremarkable, a brief transit through the suburban sprawl that would soon become the backdrop for one of the most clinically dissected law enforcement responses in modern history. The Uber arrived at the high school at 2:19 p.m. The vehicle pulled up near the 1200 building, a three-story structure commonly referred to as the Freshman Building. Cruz exited the car, donned a tactical vest filled with magazines, and slung his AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle. He was not immediately intercepted. A campus monitor, Andrew Medina, spotted him. Medina recognized Cruz as the former student who was prohibited from carrying a backpack on campus, famously referred to as the crazy boy among security staff. Despite the immediate recognition of a threat profile, a code red was not called. Medina radioed a colleague regarding a suspicious subject, but did not lock down the school. This delay, a matter of mere seconds, allowed Cruz to enter the east stairwell of Building 12 unchallenged. It was here that the first cognitive decision contradicting a plea of insanity occurred. Cruz encountered a student, Chris McKenna, in the stairwell. Rather than engaging the target, Cruz instructed McKenna to leave, warning him that things were going to get messy. This specific interaction demonstrated an awareness of morality, a distinction between a random target and a bystander he chose to spare, and a clear understanding of the violence he was about to unleash. At 2:21 p.m., the first shots rang out. The initial volley was not a frantic spray of bullets, but a methodical execution of fire. Cruz moved into the first-floor hallway. The sound was deafening, amplified by the concrete acoustics of the school corridor. He fired into classrooms 1215, 1214, and 1216. The glass panels in the doors shattered, exposing the students and teachers huddled inside to direct fire. In these opening moments, the sheer kinetic energy of the rifle rounds tore through the environment. Dust pulverized drywall, and smoke began to fill the air, creating a sensory overload that disoriented those inside the classrooms. Athletic director Chris Hickson, hearing the disturbance, ran toward the sound of the gunfire, a reflex of protection that would cost him his life. He was shot near the entryway. Assistant football coach Aaron Feiss also responded, shielding students with his own body before being mortally wounded. The timeline here is measured in heartbeats. Within minutes, 11 people on the first floor were dead or dying, and 13 others were wounded. The shooter's movement was predatory. He did not sprint. He walked with a chilling, rhythmic pace, firing, scanning, and reloading. As the firing continued, the smoke from the discharged rounds triggered the building's fire alarm. This introduced a new layer of chaos. Students on the third floor, unaware of the active shooter below, believed a fire drill was commencing. They began to evacuate their classrooms, filling the hallways just as the shooter made his way to the stairwell. On the second floor, the shooter found the hallway mostly empty. The teachers, hearing the gunfire from below, had effectively locked down their classrooms and moved students into hard corners, out of the line of sight from the door, windows. Crews fired into 2 classrooms on the second floor, but did not attempt to breach the locked doors. Finding no available targets, he moved toward the third floor. The situation on the third floor was catastrophic. Because the fire alarm had drawn students and teachers into the hallway, the scene crews arrived at was one of exposed vulnerability. When the gunfire became audible and distinct, a panic ensued as students tried to rush back into their classrooms. However, due to safety protocols, the doors locked automatically from the outside. Teachers struggled to unlock them amidst the crush of terrified teenagers. Several students and teachers were trapped in the open corridor. Crews reached the top of the stairs and opened fire. The confined space meant there was nowhere to run. Scott Beigel, a geography teacher, was shot while holding a door open to usher students to safety. Meadow Pollock and others were pinned in the alcove of a classroom door, unable to enter. The shooter engaged them with lethal precision. He fired round after round into the huddle of students. Then, a mechanical failure intervened. The rifle jammed. Crews attempted to clear the weapon, but was unsuccessful. At this juncture, the spree had lasted approximately 6 minutes. He discarded the rifle in the stairwell along with his vest. This action marks the second critical pivot point in the psychological profile of the event. A person in the grip of a chaotic delusion might have continued to struggle with the weapon or remained on the scene. Crews, however, immediately shifted strategies from offense to evasion. He ran down the stairs, blending into the crowd of terrified students who were now fleeing the building as police units began to breach the perimeter. He exited Building 12, hidden in plain sight, a wolf among the sheep he had just finished hunting. The law enforcement response was massive but hampered by a crucial technological disconnect. As Coral Springs Police and Broward Sheriff's deputies converged on the school, they accessed the school's security camera feed to locate the shooter. They relayed information that the suspect was moving between floors, preparing to engage him. What they did not realize was that the footage was on a 20-minute delay. They were hunting a ghost. While officers were stacking up on classroom doors and clearing the bloody hallways of Building 12, believing the gunman was just around the corner, Cruz was already walking away from the campus. He managed to slip through the dragnet before a secure perimeter could be fully established, walking casually past the tennis courts and leaving the school grounds entirely. The timeline of his escape is characterized by an unnerving juxtaposition of horror and mundane consumerism. After leaving the scene of one of the deadliest school shootings in American history, Cruz walked toward a nearby Walmart, He entered the store at 2:50 p.m. He went to the Subway restaurant located inside and purchased a drink. He did not appear frantic. He did not scream or draw attention to himself. He stood in line, paid, and walked out. This behavior suggests a rapid de-escalation of adrenaline, a capability to compartmentalize the atrocity he had just committed and reintegrate into social norms to ensure survival. From Walmart, he walked to a McDonald's, sitting down for a brief period before leaving again. He was essentially cooling off, waiting for a ride, or simply aimlessly drifting while the entire region descended into panic. Meanwhile, the investigation at the school had identified him. Students and staff who had survived the encounter provided a name: Nicholas Cruz. The description went out over the radio channels. A white male, roughly 5'7", wearing a burgundy junior ROTC shirt and a black baseball cap. This description was relayed to every patrol unit in the area. The manhunt expanded rapidly from the immediate school grounds to the surrounding neighborhoods of Parkland and Coral Springs. The sirens were constant, a wailing backdrop to the afternoon, as parents rushed toward the school and helicopters chopped the air overhead. At 3:40 p.m., roughly an hour and 20 minutes after the shooting began, Officer Michael Leonard of the Coconut Creek Police Department was patrolling the residential streets of Coral Springs, specifically the Wyndham Lakes neighborhood. He was scanning the sidewalks, looking for anyone matching the description of the suspect. He spotted a lone male walking on the sidewalk near the corner of Wyndham Lakes Boulevard and Coral Ridge Drive. The individual was wearing a burgundy shirt and a black hat. Officer Leonard slowed his vehicle. The subject looked at the police car and looked away, maintaining his pace. It was a subtle reaction, but enough to trigger the officer's instinct. Leonard pulled his vehicle to the curb, exited, and drew his weapon. The confrontation was brief and devoid of the dramatic resistance one might expect from a killer who had just taken 17 lives. Officer Leonard ordered Cruz to the ground. There was no negotiation, no standoff, and crucially, no evidence of a psychotic break. Cruz did not scream at invisible demons or claim he was being controlled by external forces. He complied. He dropped to his knees and then lay flat on the grass. Officer Leonard approached, handcuffed him, and the manhunt was over. The arrest was executed with textbook precision. Cruz was unarmed at the time of capture, having left his arsenal back in the stairwell of the school. Following the arrest, Cruz was transported to Broward Health North Hospital. This is standard procedure to ensure the suspect is medically cleared for detention, especially given a report that he might have struggled with breathing or anxiety during the arrest. In the emergency room, he was surrounded by medical staff and law enforcement. His demeanor during this period was described as quiet, almost soft-spoken. He answered questions regarding his medical history with coherence. There was no babbling, no catatonic state, and no hallucination. He was lucid. This period of medical observation provided the first clinical baseline of his mental state post-incident. He was aware of his surroundings, aware of the identity of the officers, and aware of his own physical condition. After being cleared by the hospital staff, he was transported to the Broward Sheriff's Office headquarters for interrogation. It is during this transport and the subsequent processing that the timeline shifts from the physical act of violence to the construction of the legal narrative. The ride to the station was captured on dashcam and bodycam footage. Cruz sat in the back of the cruiser, largely silent. The gravity of the situation seemed to have settled upon him, yet his reactions remained muted. He did not ask about the victims. He did not ask about the school. His focus was internal, self-preserving. Upon arrival at the station, the intake process began. The removal of his clothing for evidence, the swabbing of his hands for gunshot residue, and the photographing of his person were conducted with clinical detachment. The investigators noted his flat affect. He was compliant, moving where he was told to move, sitting where he was told to sit. The erratic behavior he would later exhibit in the interrogation room, the punching of his own face, the whispering about demons, had not yet begun. The arrest and transport phase is critical because it bridges the gap between the massacre and the confession. It serves as a control sample of his behavior. During the shooting, he was methodical. During the escape, he was cunning and adaptive. During the arrest, he was submissive and compliant. At no point in this 2-hour window did he exhibit the disorganized, chaotic behavior associated with a man who had lost his grip on reality. The sequence of events from 2:19 p.m. to 3:41 p.m. reveals a mind that was operating with a high degree of executive function. The decision to take an Uber, the timing of the entry, the tactical movement through the building, the exploitation of the fire alarm confusion, and the successful blending with the fleeing crowd all point to a rational, albeit evil, train of thought. The arrest by Officer Leonard confirmed this. Cruz did not force a suicide by cop scenario. He did not fight to the death. When faced with the overwhelming authority of the state, embodied by a single officer with a gun, he chose self-preservation. He chose to live. This choice fundamentally undermines the narrative of a man driven by an uncontrollable urge for destruction. He could control the urge when it suited him. He could turn the violence off when the risk to his own safety became too great. As he sat in the holding cell, waiting for the detectives to enter, the magnitude of the tragedy was only just beginning to be understood by the outside world. 17 families were shattered. A community was irrevocably scarred. The timeline of the unthinkable act was complete, solidified in police logs and security footage. What remained was the attempt to explain it, and for Nicholas Cruz, the attempt to evade the consequences of it. But the timeline itself, the cold, hard chronology of his actions, would stand as the silent, irrefutable witness against his coming performance. The facts of the afternoon showed a predator who hunted, killed, escaped, and hid, only surrendering when the game was up. There was no insanity in the timeline, only a brutal, calculating clarity. The transition from the streets of Coral Springs to the sterile environment of the interrogation room marked the end of the physical violence and the beginning of the psychological gamesmanship. The arrest was not just the apprehension of a suspect, it was the securing of the biological evidence of the crime. The shooter himself, his hands, still coated in the microscopic residue of the ammunition he had expended, were bagged. His clothes, the burgundy shirt and the pants he had worn to blend in, were seized. Every physical trace of the day was catalogued. Yet, the most important evidence was his behavior. The officers who handled him during those initial hours noted his calm. He was not a man waking up from a nightmare. He was a man who had just finished a job. The disconnect between the carnage at the school and the quiet surrender on the grass creates a jarring dissonance, one that investigators would probe in the hours to come. As the sun began to set on Parkland, the crime scene at Building 12 was frozen in time. The backpacks were still in the hallways. The unfinished tests were still on the desks. The silence that fell over the school was heavy and unnatural, broken only by the movements of the SWAT teams clearing the building room by room, marking the locations of the fallen. In the interview room at the sheriff's office, the camera was turned on. A bottle of water was placed on the table. The chair was positioned. Nicholas Cruz was led in, shuffling in his shackles, preparing to play the role of a lifetime. But the audience, the detectives, the prosecutors, and eventually the jury, would view his performance through the lens of the timeline that had just played out. A timeline that allowed no room for demons, only for a young man who made 1,000 conscious choices to kill, and one final choice to submit. The investigation into the specific movements of the shooter revealed further damning details regarding his mental state. Ballistics analysis later showed the trajectory of bullets fired through windows was not random. They were aimed at clusters of students, hiding in what they thought were safe zones. This requires cognitive processing, visual acquisition of targets, and adjustments of aim. It is the antithesis of a blind, psychotic rage. Furthermore, the discarded equipment in the stairwell was not thrown down in a fit of madness, but left in a way that allowed for a rapid descent. He didn't drop the gun in the hallway where he might be seen. He dropped it in the stairwell, a transitional space. Every physical action taken by Cruz between 2:19 p.m. and 3:41 p.m. served a logical purpose in the context of his goal: to inflict maximum casualties and then to minimize personal harm. Officer Leonard's report of the arrest highlights a specific detail. Cruz was walking with his head down, trying to avoid eye contact with passing cars. This demonstrates a clear understanding of guilt and the knowledge that he was being hunted. A person disconnected from reality does not typically understand the concept of being a fugitive. They do not understand the significance of a police cruiser slowing down. Cruz understood all of it. He read the environment, identified the threat to his freedom, and reacted with submission to avoid being shot. This singular moment on the grass in Coral Springs serves as the bookend to the violence. It is the moment the demon allegedly vanished, replaced by a terrified teenager facing the full weight of the law. The logistical aftermath of the arrest involved a complex coordination of agencies. The FBI, the ATF, the FDLE, and local jurisdictions had to interface immediately. Cruz was moved from the hospital to the sheriff's headquarters in a secure convoy. The security was tight, reflecting the high-profile nature of the prisoner. Inside the vehicle, the silence continued. There were no outbursts. The quiet was pervasive. It was as if the energy required to commit the atrocity had drained him, leaving a hollow vessel. But this vessel was not empty of reason. It was simply conserving energy for the next phase. The interrogation that would follow was anticipated to be difficult. Detectives prepared for a suspect who might be non-responsive, violent, or truly incoherent. Instead, they would receive a performance that was pitiable in its execution and transparent in its intent. The timeline of the arrest also preserved the integrity of the legal case. Because Officer Leonard followed protocol perfectly, there were no grounds for the defense to claim excessive force or a violation of rights during the apprehension. The Miranda warning was read, the medical clearance was obtained, the chain of custody for the suspect was unbroken. This procedural adherence ensured that everything Cruz said and did from the moment of his capture would be admissible in court. The foundation for the prosecution was laid not just in the forensic evidence at the school, but in the constitutional correctness of the arrest. As the chapter of the shooting closed and the chapter of the legal aftermath began, the contrast between the two worlds was stark. In Building 12, the air was still thick with the smell of iron and cordite. In the interrogation room, the air was conditioned and stale. But the link between them was the young man in the hospital gown, sitting with his head in his hands. The unthinkable act was over. The acting was about to begin. But the timeline, the cold, unyielding sequence of minutes and seconds, had already told the truth. He had tried to act insane, but the meticulous, calculated, and self-preserving nature of his actions had already failed him miserably. The atmosphere inside the Broward County Courthouse had shifted from the raw, visceral grief of the victim impact statements to the sterile cold precision of forensic psychiatry. This was the penalty phase of the trial of Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter. He had already pleaded guilty to 17 counts of murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. The jury was not deciding if he did it, but whether he deserved to die for it. The defense strategy relied heavily on painting a portrait of a broken brain, a young man ravaged by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and overwhelmed by involuntary mental illness. They argued he was a vessel for chaos, not a calculated architect of death. But as the trial pivoted to the state's rebuttal case, the narrative began to fracture. The courtroom watched as the prosecution prepared to dismantle the idea that the defendant was a helpless victim of his own mind. This was the moment the mask would be peeled back to reveal the calculation underneath. The prosecution called Dr. Charles Scott, a forensic psychiatrist from the University of California, Davis. Dr. Scott was not there to offer vague theories. He had spent hours interviewing the defendant, reviewing medical records, and analyzing the digital footprint left behind in the months leading up to the massacre. His testimony was designed to be the definitive answer to the defense's claims of organic brain damage and psychosis. As Dr. Scott took the stand, the defendant sat at the defense table, his posture slumped, his eyes hidden behind large glasses, scribbling incessantly on a notepad with colored pencils. It was a behavior he had maintained throughout the trial, an almost childlike affectation that suggested he was disengaged from reality. Dr. Scott, however, had seen a very different version of Nicholas Cruz, and he was about to show the jury exactly what he meant. The core of Dr. Scott's testimony revolved around the concept of malingering. In clinical terms, malingering is the intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms, motivated by external incentives. In a capital murder trial, the incentive is the avoidance of the death penalty. Dr. Scott explained to the jury that diagnosing malingering requires a careful comparison between the defendant's reported symptoms and the known clinical presentation of genuine mental illness. He began to walk the jury through the video-recorded forensic interviews he had conducted with the defendant in the Broward County Jail. On the courtroom monitors, the footage began to play. The defendant, on the screen, appeared markedly different from the slouching figure in the courtroom. In the video, he was alert, engaged, and articulate, though he attempted to weave a narrative of demonic possession. He told Dr. Scott that he heard a voice. He called the voice the demon or the evil one. When Dr. Scott pressed for details, the defendant claimed the voice was commanding him to kill. This is a common trope in Hollywood depictions of schizophrenia, but Dr. Scott paused the video to explain to the jury why this was clinically suspicious. In genuine auditory hallucinations, voices are rarely continuous, linear narratives that guide a person through complex tasks over a period of years. Genuine hallucinations are usually fragmented, distressing, and often interfere with a person's ability to function. The defendant, however, described a voice that was conveniently situational. Dr. Scott pointed out the selective nature of these alleged hallucinations. The defendant claimed the demon commanded him to burn, kill, and destroy. Yet, the defendant also admitted that the voice went away when he wanted to play video games or listen to music. Dr. Scott noted the clinical absurdity of this claim. A severe psychotic break does not pause for leisure activities. The demon did not interrupt his ability to research gun modifications, nor did it interfere with his ability to navigate the complex social landscape of purchasing a firearm legally. The voice was an excuse, not a symptom. It was a shield the defendant was attempting to construct between himself and the consequences of his actions. The testimony deepened as Dr. Scott introduced the results of the standardized tests he had administered. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the defendant's performance on the SIMS, the structured inventory of malingered symptomatology. This is a screening tool designed to detect people who are faking mental illness. The test consists of questions about bizarre and atypical symptoms that sound like they might be crazy to a layperson, but are almost never seen in actual psychiatric patients. For example, a question might ask if the person can see the air they breathe, or if they forget the names of their parents every morning. A person with genuine schizophrenia will answer no, because their illness does not work that way. A person faking schizophrenia, relying on pop culture stereotypes of madness, will often answer yes, thinking that more symptoms equal more insanity. Dr. Scott revealed that the defendant's score on the SIMS was not just high, it was astronomical. He endorsed a laundry list of symptoms that were clinically incompatible. He claimed to have memory loss, psychosis, depression, and neurological deficits that contradicted one another. The defendant was throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. He was trying too hard. Dr. Scott explained that true mental illness has a structure, a pattern of pathology. The defendant's symptoms were a chaotic jumble of what he thought a crazy person should be. This was the hallmark of a poor performance. He was overacting the role of the madman. The dismantling continued with the analysis of the defendant's behavior during the shooting itself. The defense had suggested that the defendant was in a dissociative state, disconnected from reality during the massacre. Dr. Scott countered this with a timeline of cold, rational decision-making. He walked the jury through the Uber ride to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The defendant had the presence of mind to load his rifle magazines beforehand. He had the foresight to wear a vest to carry the ammunition. He knew exactly which building to enter. Most critically, when his rifle jammed during the attack, he cleared the malfunction. This was a specific, learned mechanical skill that required focus and dexterity. A person in the throes of a psychotic break or a dissociative fugue does not typically possess the cognitive bandwidth to troubleshoot a weapon malfunction under stress. The defendant's actions were goal-directed. He was hunting, not hallucinating. Dr. Scott then directed the jury's attention to the defendant's internet history. This was perhaps the most devastating blow to the defense's narrative of a helpless, broken child. The digital forensics revealed a history of searches that were chilling in their lucidity. In the weeks before the shooting, the defendant had not been searching for help with voices. He had been searching for information on the Columbine shooting, the Aurora theater shooting, and police response times. But beyond the research on killing, there was research on the aftermath. He had searched for terms related to the death penalty, capital, punishment, and, most damningly, how to feign insanity. The jury sat in silence as Dr. Scott connected the dots. The defendant had researched the symptoms of sociopaths. He had looked up the diagnostic criteria for various mental illnesses. He was studying the behavior the jury was seeing. The demon, the voices, the slumping, the vacant stare was not the result of a biological defect. It was a script. It was a performance that had been rehearsed. The defendant had looked up the answers to the test before taking it. Dr. Scott's voice remained even and professional, as he characterized this not as a tragedy of mental health, but as a calculated attempt to manipulate the justice system. The footage of the interview played on. In one particularly telling exchange, the defendant described his nightly routine with the demon. He claimed the voice kept him awake, tormenting him. Dr. Scott then pointed out the jail logs. Corrections officers check on inmates at regular intervals, noting their behavior. The logs showed that on the nights the defendant claimed to be thrashing in spiritual agony, he was observed sleeping soundly, eating his meals, and interacting normally with staff. There was no objective evidence of the internal war he claimed to be fighting. The reality of his incarceration was mundane, boring, and quiet. The drama only existed when the camera was on or when a doctor was in the room. Dr. Scott also highlighted the defendant's selective competency. During the evaluation, the defendant attempted to appear confused about simple concepts. He would hesitate on basic math or claim not to understand simple words. Yet, when the conversation turned to his interests, specifically firearms and ballistics, his IQ seemed to jump 20 points. He corrected Dr. Scott on the specifics of the AR-15 platform versus other rifles. He discussed the velocity of different calibers with the precision of a hobbyist. This, Dr. Scott argued, was inconsistent with the global cognitive impairment the defense was claiming. Brain damage does not selectively spare the knowledge of ballistics while erasing the ability to do basic arithmetic. The defendant was playing dumb, but his vanity regarding his knowledge of weapons kept causing him to break character. The narrative of the broken child was further eroded by the testimony regarding antisocial personality disorder. Dr. Scott diagnosed the defendant not with schizophrenia or a fetal alcohol syndrome-induced psychosis, but with ASPD. He explained the criteria to the jury: a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, and lack of remorse. He fit every category. The defendant wasn't killing because he was confused. He was killing because he was angry and he wanted to be infamous. The voices were a cover story for a deep-seated rage and a desire for notoriety. Dr. Scott noted that the defendant had expressed a desire to be the next school shooter on YouTube comments months prior. This was a long-term goal, a career aspiration, not a sudden snap of reality. As the expert testimony concluded, the focus shifted back to the defendant in the courtroom. The behavior that had seemed pitiful days ago now looked manipulative. The coloring, the head hanging, the refusal to look at the victims' families, it all began to look like a shield. He was hiding in plain sight. The defense tried to rehabilitate their case on cross-examination, suggesting that Dr. Scott was biased or that he was ignoring the nuance of the defendant's tragic upbringing. They pointed to the mother's alcohol use, the chaotic home life, the behavioral issues in school. Dr. Scott did not deny these factors existed. He simply argued that they did not amount to insanity. A person can have a bad childhood and still know that murdering 17 people is wrong. A person can have learning disabilities and still have the capacity to plan a massacre. The presence of one tragedy does not excuse the creation of another. The climax of this phase of the trial came when the prosecution played a video the defendant recorded on his own cell phone days before the shooting. This was the rawest evidence of his mental state, stripped of the filter of a forensic interview. In the video, the defendant held the camera selfie style. He was calm, collected, and chillingly excited. He announced his plan to be the next school shooter of 2018. He detailed how he would take the Uber, climb the stairs, and open fire. He laughed. He made sound effects of the gunshots. "Pew, pew, pew," he said, smiling. There was no demon in the video. There was no voice commanding him against his will. There was only a young man reveling in the power he was about to exert over others. Dr. Scott used this video to drive the final nail into the coffin of the insanity defense. He pointed out the congruence between the defendant's stated mood in the video and his actions. The affect was appropriate to the content. He was happy about the prospect of killing. In a psychotic disorder, there is often a flattening of effect or an incongruence where the emotional expression does not match the situation. Here, the defendant was excited about his plan. He was looking forward to it. He waved goodbye to the camera, saying, "You will all know who I am." This was the motive. Not demons, not confusion, not a broken brain. Fame, infamy, recognition. He wanted the world to know his name, and he was willing to trade his life and the lives of 17 others to get it. The cross-examination of the defense's experts had already weakened the foundation of their arguments, but Dr. Scott's testimony demolished the structure entirely. He systematically addressed the specific neuropsychological tests the defense had relied upon. He explained the concept of effort testing. In neuropsychology, before you can measure how well a brain works, you have to measure if the person is trying. The defendant had failed the effort tests. On the memory malingering tests, he scored lower than chance. Dr. Scott explained that if you give a person a two-choice test, even a person with zero memory who is guessing blindly will get 50% right. To get almost 0% right requires a person to know the correct answer and intentionally choose the wrong one. The defendant's test results were mathematically impossible for a person who was simply impaired. They were the results of a person who was actively lying. The jury absorbed this information. The complexity of the human mind was being reduced to data points, and the data points screamed deception. The defense's narrative of the broken boy crumbled under the weight of the calculating predator. The vivid descriptions of the defendant's internal world, provided by the defense lawyers, stood in stark contrast to the cold, hard facts of his internet search history and his own self-recorded videos. The trial was no longer about why he did it. It was about how hard he had tried to trick them into thinking he couldn't help it. As the rebuttal phase neared its end, the courtroom dynamic had palpably changed. The sympathy that might have existed for a child, failed by the system, had evaporated. In its place was a realization of the depth of the betrayal. The defendant had not only taken innocent lives, he was now attempting to exploit the very compassion of the society he had attacked. He was using the language of mental health, a language designed to protect the vulnerable, as a weapon to save his own skin. The insanity was a costume, and Dr. Scott had just turned on the lights. The final moments of Dr. Scott's testimony focused on the synthesis of all the data. He presented a cohesive picture of a personality that was antisocial, narcissistic, and sadistic. He rejected the notion that the defendant was a passenger in his own body. He affirmed that on February 14, 2018, Nicolas Cruz made a series of thousands of choices. He chose to buy the gun. He chose to practice. He chose the day. He chose the victims. And now he was choosing to lie about it. The performance, Dr. Scott concluded, was a failure. The symptoms were too loud, the logic too flawed, and the evidence of planning too overwhelming. The defendant had tried to act insane, but he lacked the sophistication to pull it off against a trained eye. He had mirrored what he thought madness looked like, but he had only succeeded in reflecting his own malice. The prosecution rested its rebuttal. The silence that followed was heavy. The jury looked at the defendant, who continued to color in his book, head down, avoiding the gaze of the room. But the context of that image had changed. It no longer looked like the behavior of a confused child. It looked like the petulance of a court liar. The trial would continue to closing arguments, but the narrative battle over the defendant's mind had been decisively fought. The facade of the demon, the voices and the broken brain lay in ruins, dismantled by the clinical precision of the expert rebuttal. The performance was over. The reality of the crime remained. The spectacle of the Broward County courtroom eventually gave way to the raw, unfiltered agony of the penalty phase. For weeks, the defense had mounted a narrative of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and broken neurodevelopment, attempting to contextualize the massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School as the byproduct of a damaged brain rather than a depraved heart. Yet, this clinical framework collapsed under the weight of the victim impact statements. The parents and siblings of the 17 deceased did not see a patient. They saw a predator who had meticulously simulated psychosis to evade consequences. When the jury returned with a recommendation for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole rather than the death penalty, the courtroom atmosphere fractured. While Nicholas Cruz avoided lethal injection, he could not escape the vitriol poured upon him by the bereaved. Family members stood just feet away, refusing to grant him the notoriety of a mythological monster, reducing him instead to a pathetic, broken error of a human being. Judge Elizabeth Scherer formally imposed the sentence of 34 consecutive life terms, a mathematical guarantee that the defendant would die within the confines of the Florida Department of Corrections. This moment marked the final dissolution of his carefully constructed facade. The demon he had claimed voiced commands during his initial interrogation with Detective John Kirkshow was nowhere to be found. The forensic assessments by Dr. Charles Scott had already laid bare the calculated nature of his malingering, utilizing the SIRS-2 and MFAST tests to prove the defendant was exaggerating symptoms to mimic a caricature of mental illness. Now, stripped of the legal team that had shielded him and the cameras that had fed his narcissism, the reality of his existence began. Upon transfer from the county jail to the reception center, the transition from high-profile defendant to inmate U62995 was instantaneous and absolute. The distinct features he had maintained were shaved away, replaced by the standard issue white uniform that stripped him of all individuality. In the stark, concrete reality of the state prison system, the theater of insanity holds no currency. The complex narratives of demons and voices are replaced by the rigid, monotonous schedule of head counts, meal trays, and recreation yards. While he is often segregated for his own protection, the social hierarchy of the general prison population permeates the walls. He exists now in a state of permanent irrelevance, surrounded by violent offenders who view his crimes not with awe, but often with disgust, particularly given the defenseless nature of his victims. The legacy he sought to build, one of terrifying power and supernatural influence, was dismantled by the clinical precision of the trial and the crushing banality of his sentence. He remains there today, not as the anti-hero he researched and idolized, but as a silent, aging occupant of a cage, forced to live every remaining day with the lucid, unmedicated realization that his performance failed to fool anyone. The verdict delivered by the jury in Centennial, Colorado, marked the absolute dismantling of James Holmes's elaborate charade. After extensive deliberation, the rejection of the insanity plea signaled a definitive end to the killer's attempt to evade culpability through a fabricated veil of psychosis. The outcome underscored a profound irony central to the proceedings, which was that the very measures Holmes took to construct the persona of a madman were the incontrovertible proofs of his sanity. His meticulous planning, from the acquisition of ballistic gear to the intricate rigging of explosive booby traps intended to divert first responders, required a level of cognitive foresight incompatible with the legal definition of insanity. The notebook he mailed to psychiatrist Dr. Lynn Fenton, seemingly a testament to his unraveling, served effectively as a ledger of premeditation, documenting a rational calculation of human life against a narcissistic desire for infamy. Every calculated step he took to minimize resistance and maximize casualties demonstrated a lucid understanding of cause and effect, transforming his defense strategy into an indictment of his own consciousness of guilt. For the survivors and the families of the 12 victims who perished in the Aurora Theatre, the verdict offered a solemn and necessary vindication. It stripped away the clinical abstractions and forced the historical record to reflect the massacre not as an uncontrollable symptom of disease, but as a deliberate, autonomous act of malevolence. The resilience of the community stood in stark contrast to the defendant's hollow manipulation, proving that truth possesses a gravity that no amount of theatricality can escape. In the final analysis, the jury looked past the dyed hair and the feigned disorientation to see the cold logic underneath. Holmes tried to engineer a narrative of mental collapse, but the evidence revealed only the architecture of evil.